And welcome to this week's Strugglecast. We're going to talk about the criminal justice system and how it's failing millions of Americans, and maybe some solutions, maybe some discussion, but that's what we're going to talk about. So, I hope everyone's had a great week. While you're doing it, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. If you disagree with any of this or have any pushback, go ahead and comment, do whatever. Anything you can think of actually helps with the algorithm a little bit. So, what we're going to get in today is, man, it's a multifaceted thing, and keeping on our tradition of trying to move through a few progressive things that are historical, and so now we're going to leap to the future and talk about kind of a hidden crisis that's only getting worse. And just like any can that you kick down the street, eventually the can falls apart or you run out of can, or street, rather. All you listening on the podcast, you can go over to YouTube as well if you want to see what a middle-aged man looks like. And if you are just listening, I am drinking coffee, so if you hear the occasional like horrible noise, that is definitely me. So welcome here to the shed. This week we're going to talk about the criminal justice system and where it's kind of failing in some aspects. I'd seen some articles, and I kind of saw this a couple weeks ago, so I wanted to dive into this because I can't help but do a little bit of analysis when I see things, and the numbers were just kind of staggering. So right now in the United States, we currently have over 2 million people incarcerated. That's larger than any number in the world, any country by far. We incarcerate more people than any other nation on earth. So a little bit over 2 million current. Okay, so let's think about that. That's just right now. That's not have been or on probation or anything like that. So let's look at how many of those people that do get out recommit. And, that's called the recidivism rate. And after 1 year, approximately 45% reoffend. Within a 5-year period, it's a staggering 78%. So you're like, oh, so 2/3 or 3/4, well over 3/4 of the prison population that gets out, which inevitably they do. I mean, most of them aren't there for violent offenses or any threats to society, so they'll eventually circle back into society. So that's kind of wild that 3/4 of those people, 3 out of 4 of those people, actually more, almost, statistically, will be back in some form of institutionalized incarceration in 5 years. That is nuts to me. So then I was like, well, what does that do for the population? You know what I mean? Like, how does that extrapolate out? And it turns out there are shade over 80 million Americans with a criminal record, and almost 9% of all American citizens have a felony. It's like almost 1 in 10. That's just, okay. Now, what's horrible here, and then we can get into the race breakdown into this too, because it always indirectly affects minority communities. And I would also argue, as a person from the American South, a lot of this is class-based as well. It's basically poor people, which I think some of the intent is to keep the division, but the numbers are the numbers. 33% of all black males in America have a felony, according to this data. That rate. That's nuts. That's absolutely nuts. And so now we have to get into how does this occur. And I think a lot of it goes towards there aren't there are no, the programs don't seem to be the models that were going on, I guess, post New Deal, to tie that all together. And click on one of those if you're so inclined. It's not really set up for a rehabilitation as much as it is like human warehousing. It's become so politicized that the get tough on crime, let's just put people somewhere. Well, that seems to have an indirect problem where it kind of, or maybe it was direct, who knows? But that would be a hard charge to level, right? But so once they become disenfranchised, and it kind of becomes this perpetuating cycle. So you're not really getting rid of the crime, you're just getting rid of the actor at the time. And there are a lot of triggers for that, and a lot of it's poverty. This day and age especially, we're finding out the new data, and over the last few years, the mental health in our nation has taken a hit, especially in the younger people, and they're having to deal with a lot. Let's not forget that, this is great times for a lot, but inequity has never been greater. I mean, we are in the Gilded Age. I mean, we are more disproportionately out of whack as far as economic terms than we were in the legit Gilded Age. Prior to the collapse, if there's any lessons in history there, following the Gilded Age was the Great Depression, and then World War II, which was horrible. So, but anyway, so you've got basically 80 million Americans. That is a huge number when you're looking at you're looking at, that's a large percentage of the population. And so instead of addressing the underlying concerns for so many years of what is causing this rapid increase, especially took off after the war on drugs in the 70s and 80s. And what's nutso about that is all these people that were victimized, to be honest, by crack cocaine. We know, or at least there's enough shade to suspect, that some of that was intentional. And maybe, let's go in good faith arguments, the unintended consequence was a wildly disproportionate number of young poor people, particularly minorities, being incarcerated at heavy rates with mandatory maximum sentences. And again, we're talking about drug offenses. And what's wild, to extrapolate further, what still boggles the mind is how now in many states marijuana is legal, yet there are still people in jail for cultivating or possessing or selling marijuana, which it seems odd that the same type people, and in some cases the exact same people that were prosecutors or had some connection in with that industry, now are the ones regulating and controlling the sales of marijuana. We have entered bizarro world. So you have all these people set up kind of to fail, especially then, we'll get into another episode maybe on after criminal justice. Maybe we can get into maybe some social programs that, are more current. I just wanted to do this because I was going to forget it. I read this article and I knew if I waited it would go away because, that's how I am. So what you do is now you're setting these people up with no real rehabilitation. It's just become warehousing. And when they cycle back, so how do you, 3 out of 4 of these people aren't going to make it. So why is that? And I want to get to the realities of the physical, but let me talk first about what this fascinating thing about, especially if you, the IQ Zoo, we talked about behaviorism. Of course, that was for conditioning animals and for an intelligence agency. However, there are some behaviorisms and things that I believe that are relevant in this situation. Institutionalization and institutional behaviors. And what's shocking is this: it seems to affect a lot of vets, homeless vets. That when you exist inside of these institutional frames and these constructs that are made of barbed wire or fence, and much like in the military, the same way. I mean, you're not going anywhere. This is your thing, right? So it's strange that some of these people can function at such a high level within that institutional setting. They don't sometimes always just as well in situations outside. It's kind of I've seen parallels here with friends that have cycled out from the military, and some that have cycled out from prisons. And there seems to be, in different ways, but the core foundation is like within the institutional framework, they were somebody. I mean, there was a modicum of respect, and then duty, and you do this, you do this, you do this. Very functional for whatever reason. However, out into a free world environment where the hierarchies are much different, and in fact, you're probably not just imagined, but going to encounter real backlash for the prior institutionalization, right? And it makes it that much harder. And I only bring that up to show how that exacerbates the physical constraints of why we have so many of these problems. And what this was really at the backdrop to is like the unemployment rate right now is absolutely nuts. And I didn't realize they don't count this necessarily into it. And I hate to be critical, but we've lost any manufacturing and industrial base, which we know is what brings prosperity, especially when partnered with labor and working class, populism. So here we have, 80 million Americans with criminal records that are fairly disenfranchised, and that's a large. Oh my God, that's a huge number. I just can't. It's just amazing that number. That means there are more incarcerated Americans with criminal records than there are citizens in the UK. I think I would have to fact check that, but we'll fact check that. So here's the reality. So you have these institutional behaviors, especially a lot of the people that are incarcerated. It wasn't their first time. Like you have infractions from being minors and juveniles, and other forms of institutionalization that has gone in through the systems, and they just seem to end up there. And then there was the school pipeline to prisons. These aren't made up things. That's the problem. Is there's a lot of intent here that has to be overcome by bad faith actors, and I don't think the average citizen understands and can relate how this might affect them. So, as we talk about economic factors and not having an industrial base, right now the market's tight. It's probably going to reverse, I think, to control inflation. Unfortunately, they're going to crush the poor and the working class with higher rates, fewer jobs, intentionally, to slow things and to have a chilling effect, and it's already, I believe, happening. That's just, I'm no financial analyst, so don't take any of my sayings to be any kind of prognostication or what you should do. I'm just saying, you take these institutional behaviors and you mix that with the reality of that 80 million Americans have a criminal record. So, and 8% of Americans have, greater than 8%, almost 9%, have felonies. So why do they keep going back and Why do we keep spending so much money? And that's the other thing is we spend so much money on warehousing people. Where if we followed the models of the rest of the civilized world, where there's not as much recidivism, and I think a lot of that's tied to a lot of things, but we're going to get to that. So here are the realities for what makes these numbers so horrific and why they affect the economy so much. Because we're talking, again, that's a huge number of people, and when you look at the fact that of that, the unemployment rate within that is almost, and in some estimates, over 50%, which gets to the realities that we want to talk about. And the first is, okay, well, if these people can't be employed in any kind of meaningful way, that actually making a living wage in the United States is already hard enough. But so to try to make a living wage, even though I don't think no one would ever say, oh, we're going to get rid of, we're not going to hire you because of your criminal history. What it happens is I think they screen it. They now with anything with a keystroke can be discovered, right? So, and it's not illegal for them to disqualify candidates for that reason. And in a lot of states, it's been made easier. So that tends to be what happened. And so now you're talking, wow, that would mean that there's at least 10 to 15 million out of work people that could potentially be working. And what compounds even the fact that even if they could find a job, right? Most housing now requires these criminal background checks, which I'm conflicted about. Of course, you want to protect your property and your people, but and I guess it's hard to do case by cases, but maybe that's what we have to go back to. But anyway, so they can't find work and they can't find housing. And I really feel bad for the younger people, and I'm going to be talking like an old man here, but because I don't know anything about the swiping right and all that good stuff. But from the younger people I know, man, it's tough, being in relationships and trying to date and all that junk now. So with every dating app, they do background checks and stuff. So what if the kid that got in trouble at like 18 or 19 is, compounded again without a job and without housing, hard to make any kind of relationships. And we live in a country that could, but doesn't have any kind of meaningful safety net. I'm not a proponent of anyone. If the longer you listen, you'll figure out that I'm definitely not a party guy. I'm a policy guy. When I hear things that make sense, I kind of like to go with that. And so the idea of a universal basic income makes a lot of sense to me. There are tons of things that we can do for our safety net to help not only these disenfranchised people, but all disenfranchised people. Again, making an investment, particularly in the youth, which means, bring back the child tax credit, end child poverty, get our country on a solid foundation. It's not based on, right now, it just seems like we do the right now. Even our construction is crap. I mean, it's built for what gets it done the quickest. We don't seem to put any architectural style or aesthetic to things anymore as much. Maybe that's just me. Again, there's the old man rant. But back to the subject. So you take these institutionalized behaviors and you mix it with the fact that it's incredibly hard for them to find work in any meaningful way, to make money, housing, religion. And then the bombardment, and this is a side note, I'm going to blame a little on the media, this constant bombardment of more, you've got this, and bad decisions are made, but in some cases it may not have a choice in the decision. And I know it's hard for a lot of people to accept, but shit happens, especially people in really bad circumstance that have been in bad circumstance, surrounded by bad circumstance, Man, you have no idea. None of us have any idea, unless you're in that situation, what those triggers could be. From feeding your family, or just these, like I say, the institutional behaviors. This internal need to belong, or be needed, or valued in some way. So I think those could be incredible triggers for those folks. Much less to say, again, you've become warehoused and now you've become disenfranchised. There's no safety net. And what's crazy is we literally, as Americans, right in double jeopardy. And that's only from the law. However, it's strange to me that someone that, like, say, now we say this 80 million Americans with criminal records. After they've been adjudicated and done what society deems like, hey, you did XYZ, you possess this amount of narcotics or whatever, or you did this violation to society. Therefore, you owe us, this is what it's going to be to make it right. So these people go to make it right. Especially if they can't get cash bail, which we'll get into in just a second, which is another hustle. But anyway, and so you have all these Americans that have this onus on them that, so they've paid their debt to society, they've done what is asked and paid the debt in full. However, it's going to continue to be punished, even if they don't. So of the, after 5 years, numbers don't look good, but after 5 years, to say the 21% of citizens that don't reoffend and never reoffend, they will continue, even if they don't reoffend, they will continue to pay for that crime outside of a personal way, potentially for the rest of their lives, in being denied housing or benefits, or just in perceptions in society, which again allow for the legal discrimination, especially in hiring. And you'd be surprised at how many vets end up with criminal records. And again, I think a lot of it not only is just these triggers that, I mean, again, if you don't have anything and you don't really fit, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to a bad decision, right? So, then you thrive in these institutional settings because, again, they're familiar, right? So they understand them. So now we're going to talk about some of the things that maybe we could do to make it better, right? Because we want to be solution-minded. We're relatively intelligent people, right? So this is just a really compact, glossy overview. Like most things policy related, you can go down some very long and dark rabbit holes and get into the weeds to turn more cliches, because I need my coffee. All right. So the easiest, obviously, is, glaring. There's been successful job programs and rehabilitation programs throughout contemporary history, especially abroad. Don't limit ourselves to just what has and hasn't worked here. A lot of our systems here, including the idea of law enforcement anyway, is so rooted in bad faith, race, classism, and power, that I just don't know that we're necessarily the experts in these matters. However, that's just a personal opinion. But look beyond where we're at currently to see if there are any better solutions. Because again, we're done, but these are people that, if they're not thrown away, can be churning. I mean, this is all for the economy. This is for the good. Not every job. I mean, if you're laying cross ties for the railroad, I can't understand why you would need to be safety and security checked. You see what I'm saying? Like the closest you're going to get to a train is digging and chopping, right? And I'm not saying give those jobs only to be, not that they can't go beyond that, but it's a start, right? I mean, I just don't get it. So we know that there could be job training programs, and it's been effective in lots of nations and in some states in the United States. But it's just not taken off. Yet we spend so much money, an incredible amount of money, on maintaining prisons and as taxpayers, just keeping them incarcerated, fed, clothed, etc. So at least getting some of that benefit back, correct? Second problem. With that job training, it wouldn't mean anything, and this has become a movement that's kind of died off since the pandemic, but and it's been passed in several states and on the ballot in others. It's the ban the box, where people that aren't currently in any form of incarceration or are through, why would you ask them? And I bring that one up because I'm not the most, I'm not a super hard line on that. And I'm going to tell you why. The federal government, from all accounts, is the United States federal government. That is only for matters of, I guess, basic security, etc. Only go back about 12 years, meaning to get a passport or anything else, they kind of look at the totality of a lifetime, where that's not necessarily done in other aspects. So, you know, as a kid that graduated in the early 90s, we are moving into an era where there are a lot of people back in society that, because I think this number is going to get much bigger in the future, but as these folks cycle back into regular society, and they already are, and then of course the generations behind them, needing that labor force, and again back to the how long is satisfactory to punish the drug dealer after they've been out of jail 20 years. I mean, when do they stop? When does the 40-year-old stop paying for the 20-year-old sin? Especially given how attitudes have changed. You know, J.R. Cash, you know, the victim of the times type crimes, you know. There are literally people still sitting in jail for marijuana. It's nuts. And then the big one, bail reform. Cash bail reform, is kind of really an insane process when you dig down to it. Anecdotally, most people think, oh, it's there to keep society safe, so that if somebody that's really dangerous, they make the bail really high and they keep them. Well, that's not necessarily. It's kind of based on whether they can pay. If someone's dangerous and a threat to society, they don't have to let them out. And so many states have abolished the cash bail system to great success. But it cuts off, and it's an old, antiquated system that basically punishes the poor for being poor. Again, you're put in situations that are most likely to make you criminalized, then monetize your freedom. And disproportionately, obviously, if you can afford to make things go away, you can. And that's why the prisons, again, are filled, and we have 80 million Americans with criminal records. And it's a self-defeating cycle that nobody wants to really discuss, but, you know, again, I can't understand. We're talking about 80 million Americans. Wow. And we need workers. And we need production. I mean, and now, again, everybody talks about division. I'm kind of old school. It's kind of hard to be pissed off if you're tired. So if we got everybody working, everybody making a little change, doing their thing, the economy's roaring, people are working, I promise you all of those other numbers go down. But that's another discussion here on the old Struggle Cast. All right, so this has been a wide, broad brush episode of criminal justice. Like I said, it's all those articles, and those numbers are just mind-boggling to me. I hope you found it interesting. We're going to come back, and next week we'll approach another hot button topic. I haven't really decided. I've got several ideas in mind. Some of these you have to really dig into and try to figure out a way not to dig too deep, because there's a finite amount of time that I can upload, right? And put it on. So anyway, this has been the Struggle Cast. We will get back to something next week. Remember, like, subscribe, comment, do all those fun things, share with your friends, try to pass it around. And again, no indictments. However, clearly we could do better with our justice system. And again, with these, the issues I talk about are things that can be fixed relatively easy. And in fact, just by approaching the fix on some of these issues literally makes the rest of them kind of go away. Just having a better safety net would lower our burden as taxpayers on incarceration, because there would be probably less offenders. More work, better economy, and a work in meaningful way to the people that need it. Invest in tax breaks only for companies that are willing to build and hire in historically disenfranchised areas. Why isn't the infrastructure for all the agriculture somewhere on the Delta or in the Midwest where the farmers are? Keep the money where it belongs, right? Instead of trading it back and forth in Chicago and New York. But maybe that's the next discussion. We'll get into that. But anyway, the Struggle Cast, please subscribe, do all that good stuff. Keep us in the algorithm. I hope you have a great week. Be nice to people. Be nice to somebody else. You never know what they're going through. And hopefully they'll be nice to you too. See y'all later.